I stood in the middle of my tiny Portland studio, the late afternoon sun spilling through the single window and casting a warm glow over the mismatched furniture I'd scavenged from thrift stores. The faded green armchair in the corner smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a scent that always made me smile despite its worn edges. My bed, a mattress on a rickety frame, sat against the wall, draped with a quilt my grandmother had sewn before I was born. It was modest, sure, but it was mine. At 22, after years of clawing my way out of someone else's shadow, this little space felt like a kingdom. I ran my fingers along the edge of the wooden bookshelf I'd painted white last month, its shelves sagging under the weight of cookbooks and a few cracked spine novels. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the room, a steady reminder that I was alone, no footsteps thumping down the hall, no voices demanding my attention. For once, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. I caught my reflection in the smudged mirror hanging above the sink. Dark brown hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes too tired for someone my age. But there was a spark there, too, a flicker of pride I hadn't seen in years. I'd made it. A job at Taste of the Rose, a decent paycheck, a place of my own. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever been allowed to dream of back home. Home! The word twisted in my gut like a dull knife. I turned away from the mirror and sank into the armchair, letting my head tip back as memories crept in uninvited. I was 7 years old again, standing in the cramped living room of our old house on the edge of Portland. The air smelled of baby powder and burnt toast, and the twins, Avery and Mason, were screaming in their cribs. 2 tiny bundles of chaos with identical tufts of blonde hair and lungs that could wake the dead. Susan, my mother, had been pacing, her hair wild and her voice sharp as she muttered about needing a break. James, my father, was sprawled on the couch, a beer in hand, staring at the TV like it held the secrets to the universe. "Lila!" Susan had snapped, her eyes locking onto me. "Go get their bottles. Now." I'd hesitated, my small hands clutching the hem of my faded blue dress. I wasn't tall enough to reach the counter yet, not without dragging a chair over and risking a crash that'd earn me a lecture. But I didn't argue. I never did back then. I'd climbed up, wobbling on tiptoes, and grabbed the bottles from the sink where they'd been left to soak. The plastic was slippery, and one slipped from my grip, hitting the floor with a loud clatter. Susan's head whipped around, her glare cutting through me like glass. "Careful, Lila. Those cost money we don't have." I'd mumbled an apology, my cheeks burning as I handed her the bottles. She didn't thank me. She never did. But when Avery quieted down, his little hand wrapping around my finger as I held the bottle, I felt a swell of something warm in my chest. Pride, maybe. I was helping. I mattered. That was the day it started. The shift I didn't see coming. 7 years old. And suddenly I wasn't just their big sister anymore. I was the extra pair of hands, the one who could be trusted to step up. It felt good at first, like a secret badge of honor. I'd bounce between the twins' cribs, humming songs I made up, giggling when Mason drooled on my arm. Susan would pat my head sometimes, call me her little helper, and I'd beam like I'd won a prize. But now, sitting in my studio, the memory didn't feel so sweet. The pride had soured over the years, replaced by a nagging ache I couldn't shake. I stood abruptly, crossing to the window to crack it open. The cool March air rushed in, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the faint tang of rain-soaked pavement. Portland was alive outside, people hurrying home, headlights flickering through the drizzle, but in here it was just me and the ghosts of what used to be. I leaned against the sill, staring at the street below. A man in a dark coat lingered near the corner, his head down, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Something about the way he stood, too still, too watchful, sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just a guy waiting for the bus. But my fingers tightened on the window frame, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes, hidden under the brim of his hat, were fixed on my building. The phone buzzed on the counter behind me. jolting me out of my thoughts. I crossed the room in 2 quick steps and snatched it up, my heart thudding a little too fast. The screen lit up with a text from Mia, my best friend and the only person who'd stuck by me through the mess of the last few years. Asterisk, you home? Found a weird note in my mailbox. Addressed to you. Asterisk. I frowned, my thumb hovering over the keys. A note? For me? Mia lived 3 blocks away in a cramped duplex she shared with 2 roommates. Why would someone leave something for me there? Asterisk, what's it say? Asterisk, I typed back, my mouth suddenly dry. The reply came almost instantly. Asterisk, just your name, and a drawing of a rose. Creepy, right? Asterisk, my breath caught. A rose. Taste of the Rose was where I worked, had been for almost a year now. It was a cozy little restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the staff felt like family. Nick, the owner, had taken a chance on me when I showed up with no experience and a desperate need for a fresh start. He'd even offered to pay for cooking classes, said I had a knack for flavors he hadn't seen in years. A rose was their logo, stamped on the menus and etched into the sign above the door. But a drawing on a note? That wasn't some coworker's joke. It felt off. I glanced back at the window. The man in the coat was gone, the corner empty now, except for a puddle reflecting the streetlights. My pulse didn't slow, though. If anything, it kicked up a notch, a steady drumbeat of unease I couldn't ignore. Keep it safe, I texted Mia. Asterisk, I'll come by tomorrow. Asterisk. I set the phone down and wrapped my arms around myself, the quilted warmth of the studio suddenly feeling too thin. The hum of the fridge seemed louder now, almost mocking. I'd fought so hard for this independence, this quiet little life. But as I stood there, the shadows stretching longer across the floor, I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was watching, waiting, and slipping closer than I wanted to admit. The cool air from the cracked window brushed against my skin, but it did little to calm the jittery pulse racing through me. I stepped away from the sill, my bare feet padding softly against the worn hardwood floor of my studio. The faint scent of lavender from the armchair mingled with the damp, earthy smell of the rain outside, and for a moment I tried to anchor myself in those familiar comforts. But Mia's text burned in my mind, a note with my name and a rose. It wasn't just odd, it was a splinter under my skin, sharp and impossible to ignore. I crossed to the counter where my phone lay, its screen still glowing faintly with her message. My fingers twitched, itching to call her, to demand more details, but I stopped myself. It was late, and Mia would already be sprawled on her thrift store couch, probably laughing it off with her roommates. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed the chipped blue mug I'd left by the sink and filled it with water from the tap, the cold metal handle grounding me as I took a sip. The water tasted faintly of rust, a reminder of the building's age, but I barely noticed. My eyes kept darting to the window, half expecting that man in the dark coat to reappear. I set the mug down harder than I meant to, the clink echoing in the quiet. Get a grip, Lila, I told myself. It's just a note, probably some prank from a regular at the restaurant. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my stomach twisted. I'd spent years building this life, scraping by, dodging shadows from my past, and the thought of something creeping in now, something I couldn't see or control, made my chest tighten. The memory of my childhood flickered back, unbidden, like a reel of film I couldn't stop. I was 7 again, standing in the cluttered nursery of our old house in Selwood Moorland. The walls were a faded yellow, peeling at the corners, and the room smelled of talcum powder and sour milk. Avery and Mason were fussing in their cribs, their tiny fists waving in the air. I darted across the room, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, eager to grab the stack of diapers from the changing table. Susan had been slumped in the rocking chair, her eyes half closed, while James leaned against the doorframe, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Good job, Lila, he'd said, his voice gruff but warm. You're growing up fast, kiddo. Real mature for 7. I'd beamed, my chest puffing out as I handed him the diapers. Mature. The word had felt like a medal, something shiny and important. I'd practically skipped back to the twins, humming under my breath as I watched James change Mason with clumsy hands. Susan had muttered something about needing coffee, but I didn't care. I was helping. I was needed. That pride had carried me through those early days, fetching bottles, folding tiny onesies, even rocking Avery to sleep when Susan's patience ran thin. It was a game at first, a chance to prove I could keep up. But the game had changed, hadn't it? The warmth of that memory felt hollow now, tainted by the years that followed. A sharp thud snapped me back to the present. My head whipped toward the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound had come from the hallway, just outside my apartment. I froze, straining to listen. The building was old, full of creaks and groans, but this was different. Heavy, deliberate, like something or someone had hit the wall. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the door. The brass knob gleamed faintly in the dim light, and I realized with a jolt that I hadn't turned the deadbolt after coming home. Stupid, Lila. So stupid. My feet moved before my brain caught up, carrying me silently across the room. I pressed my ear to the wood, the cool surface chilling my cheek. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the radiator down the hall and the distant drip of a leaky pipe. Then it came again, another thud, softer this time, followed by a low scrape. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the wind or a neighbor stumbling home. Someone was out there. I yanked my hand back from the knob as if it burned, my mind racing. Call the police? No, not yet. They'd think I was overreacting. Mia. She was too far away. I darted to the counter, snatching a butcher knife from the block Nick had given me when I started at Taste of the Rose. The weight of it steadied my shaking hands, but only just. I crept back to the door, my breath shallow, and peered through the peephole. The hallway stretched out in a distorted fisheye view, the flickering fluorescent light casting long shadows on the chipped paint. Empty. No one was there. I exhaled, my shoulders sagging, but the relief was short-lived. Something glinted on the floor just outside my door, a small, white rectangle catching the light. A note. My throat tightened. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles whitening, and hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it, to bolt the door and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. I had to know. With a trembling hand, I slid the deadbolt into place. Better late than never. And then unhooked the chain, the faint clink sounding deafening in the silence. I cracked the door open just enough to reach out, my fingers brushing the cold floor as I snatched the paper and slammed the door shut again. The locks clicked back into place, and I pressed my back against the wood, my chest heaving as I unfolded the note. It was a single sheet, folded in half, the edges crisp like it had been handled with care. My name was scrawled across the front in sharp, black ink, Lila, no last name, no address. Below it, a rough sketch of a rose, its petals jagged and uneven, like it had been drawn in a hurry. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the words inside. Asterisk, you can't hide forever. I know where you are. Asterisk. The knife slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. My knees buckled, and I slid down the door, the note crumpling in my fist. My mind spun, grasping for answers that wouldn't come. Who? Why? The man in the coat? Someone from the restaurant? Or, my breath hitched, someone from home? Susan? James? No, they wouldn't. They didn't care enough to track me down. Did they? The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the shadows deepened. The hum of the fridge was a taunt, the lavender scent a lie. This wasn't a prank. This was a threat. And as I sat there, the note clutched against my chest, I realized with a sickening certainty that my hard-won piece was unraveling, thread by thread, shadow by shadow, and I had no idea how to stop it. The air in my studio felt thick, suffocating, as I sat crumpled against the door, the note still clenched in my fist. My breaths came in shallow bursts, each one scraping against the raw edges of my fear. The words, "You can't hide forever. I know where you are," looped through my mind like a broken record, each repetition tightening the knot in my stomach. The knife lay beside me on the floor, its blade catching the dim light from the overhead bulb, but it didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt useless against something I couldn't even name. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I pressed a hand to the door for balance. The wood was cool under my palm, a stark contrast to the heat prickling my skin. I needed to think, to move. Sitting here, waiting for the next thud or shadow wasn't an option. My eyes darted to the window again. The street below was still empty, the puddle at the corner rippling faintly under the drizzle. But the quiet outside only sharpened the unease gnawing at me. Whoever left that note knew where I lived. They'd been here, inches from me, and I hadn't even known. I stumbled to the counter, snatching my phone with unsteady hands. The screen glowed harsh and bright, Mia's last message still staring up at me. Asterisk, just your name. And a drawing of a rose. Creepy, right? Asterisk, 2 notes now. One at Mia's place, one at mine. My thumb hovered over her name, the urge to call her surging again, but I hesitated. It was past midnight now. She'd be asleep, her phone on silent. And what would I say? I got a creepy note too, and I'm losing my mind? No, I needed more than panic. I needed answers. The rose. That was the thread connecting it all. Taste of the Rose wasn't just my job, it was my lifeline, the place that had pulled me out of the wreckage of my past. Could this be tied to work? A disgruntled customer? A co-worker with a grudge? I pictured Nick's warm smile, the way he'd clapped me on the shoulder last week and said, "You're a natural, Lila. Keep this up, and you'll be running the place someday." He'd been nothing but kind. The rest of the staff, Jess with her quick laugh, Carlos with his endless playlists, felt like a mismatched little family. None of them seemed capable of this, but someone had to be. I set the phone down and grabbed a notebook from the shelf, its pages already scribbled with recipes and grocery lists. My hand shook as I flipped to a blank page and scrawled the facts I knew. Asterisk, note at Mia's, my name Rose drawing. Note here, threatening, same Rose. Man in coat outside. Asterisk, I paused, pen hovering, then added, Taste of the Rose connection. It wasn't much, but seeing it written out made it feel less like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. It gave me something to grip onto. A creak sounded from the hallway, soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent my heart hammering again. I froze, listening, the pen slipping from my fingers to clatter on the counter. The building groaned sometimes, sure, but this felt too close, too real. I crept back to the door, peering through the peephole again. The hallway stretched out, empty and shadowed, the fluorescent light flickering like a dying pulse. Nothing. No one. But the air felt charged, heavy with a presence I couldn't see. I turned away, my gaze landing on the crumpled note still on the floor. I picked it up, smoothing it out against the counter. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, each letter pressed hard into the paper, like whoever wrote it was angry or desperate. I studied the rose sketch again, its jagged petals and uneven stem. It wasn't the polished logo from the restaurant's menus. This was rough, personal. Someone had taken the time to draw it, to make it mean something. But what? My mind spun back to earlier that day, my shift at Taste of the Rose. It had been busy, the usual Friday rush of locals and tourists crowding the tables. I'd been in the kitchen most of the night, chopping onions and searing chicken, the heat of the stove sticking to my skin. Nothing stood out. No strange customers, no odd glances. Except, I frowned, a memory tugging at me. There'd been a guy at the counter near closing, mid-30s, maybe with a dark coat and a hat pulled low. He'd ordered a coffee, black, and sat there nursing it for an hour, barely touching it. I'd caught him staring once, his eyes lingering too long before he looked away. I'd brushed it off. People got weird late at night, but now that moment felt heavier. Was that him? The man I'd seen outside? My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone again, this time pulling up the restaurant's group chat. Jess had been on the floor with me tonight. She might have noticed something. I typed quickly, my fingers fumbling over the keys. Asterisk. Hey, you remember that guy at the counter tonight? Dark coat, hat? Seemed off. Asterisk. I hit send and waited, the silence stretching unbearable seconds into minutes. The radiator hissed down the hall, a low, mocking sound that made me flinch. Finally, my phone buzzed. Jess's reply, asterisk, yeah, kinda, kept to himself. Tipped decent, though. Why? Asterisk. I bit my lip, debating how much to say. Asterisk, just curious. He stick around long. Asterisk, I typed back. Another pause. Asterisk, left right after you went to the back. Didn't see him go, though. You okay? Asterisk. My stomach sank. He'd left when I did, or close to it. Had he followed me? I lived 6 blocks from the restaurant, an easy walk through Portland's quiet streets. I'd been tired, distracted, my earbuds in as I hummed along to some old playlist. I wouldn't have noticed someone trailing me. The thought made my skin crawl. Asterisk, yeah, fine. Thanks. Asterisk, I replied, keeping it vague. Jess didn't need to know yet, not until I had more to go on. I set the phone down and rubbed my eyes, exhaustion warring with the adrenaline still pumping through me. I couldn't stay here, not tonight. Not with that note burning a hole in my thoughts and the hallway's eerie, quiet pressing against the door. Mia's place was my best bet. 3 blocks wasn't far, and she'd let me crash without asking too many questions. At least not right away. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, the worn wool scratching against my arms as I shrugged it on. My keys jangled too loudly in the silence as I stuffed them in my pocket, along with the note and my phone. The knife stayed on the counter. I couldn't bring myself to carry it, not out there. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and cracked the door open again. The hallway loomed, dim and empty, the air stale with a faint smell of mildew. My sneakers squeaked faintly as I stepped out, locking the door behind me with a soft click. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound, a distant car horn, the drip of that damn pipe, felt like a warning. I moved quickly, my head down, clutching my coat tighter as I headed for the stairs. The stairwell was worse, narrow, poorly lit, the steps creaking under my weight. I kept one hand on the railing, its chipped paint flaking against my skin, and glanced over my shoulder every few seconds. Nothing followed me. No footsteps, no rustling. Just my own ragged breathing echoing off the walls. By the time I pushed through the building's front door, the cold March air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing. The street stretched out, slick with rain, the streetlights casting long, distorted reflections on the pavement. I started walking, fast, my eyes scanning every corner, every alley. The man in the coat wasn't there, or if he was better at hiding than I was at spotting him. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and I nearly dropped it pulling it out. Another text from Mia. Asterisk, you sure you're good? I can come get you. Asterisk. I swallowed hard, gratitude mixing with the fear still clawing at me. Asterisk, on my way to you. Be there soon. Asterisk, I typed back, my fingers stiff from the cold. I didn't stop moving, didn't look back. The note in my pocket felt like a lead weight, pulling me toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted. But I couldn't stop now. Whatever this was, whoever this was, I had to face it, one clue at a time. The rain had stopped by the time I reached Mia's duplex, but the air still hung heavy with dampness, clinging to my coat and chilling my skin. The streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked sidewalk. My sneakers slapped against the wet pavement, each step echoing too loudly in the stillness. I kept my head down, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, fingers brushing the crumpled edge of that damn note. Asterisk, you can't hide forever. I know where you are. Asterisk, the words pulsed in my skull, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the distant hum of traffic. Mia's place loomed ahead, a narrow, two-story building wedged between a vacant lot and a laundromat that never seemed to close. The porch light flickered, its weak beam barely reaching the steps. I climbed them two at a time, my breath puffing out in little clouds, and rapped my knuckles against the peeling red door. The sound felt intrusive, like it didn't belong in the quiet of the night. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man in the dark coat lurking at the corner. But the street stretched empty behind me, shadows pooling where the light couldn't reach. The door swung open, and Mia stood there in an oversized sweatshirt and pajama pants, her dark curls spilling messily over her shoulders. Her brown eyes widened as they landed on me, taking in my soaked coat and the wild look I couldn't hide. "Lila? Jesus, you look like you've seen a ghost. Get in here." I didn't argue. I stepped inside, the warmth of her living room wrapping around me like a blanket. The air smelled of burnt popcorn and the faint citrus of her cheap candles, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of my studio. The couch sagged under a pile of blankets, and a muted TV flickered with some late-night rerun. Mia shut the door behind me, the click of the lock louder than it should have been. "You okay?" she asked, crossing her arms and tilting her head. "You didn't sound fine in your texts. What's going on?" I opened my mouth, then closed it, the words tangling in my throat. How do you explain something you don't even understand? I pulled the note from my pocket instead, smoothing it out with shaky fingers before handing it to her. "This was outside my door tonight, right after your text." Mia's brows furrowed as she took it, her eyes scanning the jagged handwriting and the rough sketch of the rose. Her lips parted slightly, and she looked up at me, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What the hell is this? You can't hide forever." "Lila, this isn't creepy, this is messed up." "I know," I said, my voice cracking on the edges. I sank onto the couch, the springs creaking under me, and buried my face in my hands. "There was another one at your place, right? With my name and a rose." "Yeah." She crossed to a cluttered side table and dug through a stack of mail, pulling out a small envelope. She handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine. "Found it in my mailbox this afternoon. No address, no stamp. Just this." I took it, the paper cool against my skin. "My name, *Lila*, was scrawled across the front in the same sharp, angry script. Below it, another rose, its petals uneven and spiked, like something drawn in a rush. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The weight of it was enough, pressing against my chest like a stone. "Whoever this is," I said, barely above a breath, "they know where I live, where you live, and they're tying it to Taste of the Rose." I met her gaze, my stomach twisting as the pieces clicked together. "Mia, this isn't random. This is someone who knows me." She sat beside me, the couch dipping under her weight, and rested a hand on my knee. "Okay, slow down. Let's think this through. You've got a job, a life. People don't just start leaving stalker notes out of nowhere. Who could it be? Someone from work?" I shook my head, running through the faces at the restaurant again. Nick's gruff kindness, Jess's easy chatter, Carlos's playlists. I don't think so. There was this guy tonight, though, dark coat, hat, sat at the counter for ages. Jess said he left right after I did. Could have followed me home. Mia's eyes narrowed. "You didn't see him?" "No, I wasn't paying attention." I swallowed hard, the admission bitter on my tongue. "But it's not just that. I keep thinking, what if it's them? Susan and James. Your parents." Her voice spiked with disbelief. "Lila, you haven't talked to them in years. Why would they?" "Because they hate that I left." I cut in, the words spilling out faster than I could stop them. "You didn't see their faces when I walked out, Susan screaming I was ungrateful, James just staring like I'd betrayed them. I was supposed to stay, keep playing the perfect helper while they threw parties for the twins and forgot I existed. Maybe they found me. Maybe this is their way of dragging me back." Mia frowned, chewing her lip. "That's a stretch. They didn't care enough to look for you before." Why now? I don't know. My voice broke, and I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to hold back the tears prickling there. But who else could it be? I've kept my head down, Mia. I don't make enemies. I don't. A sharp knock rattled the door, cutting me off. My head snapped up, my heart lurching into my throat. Mia froze, her hand tightening on my knee. The knock came again, 3 hard raps, deliberate and loud, reverberating through the small room. The TV's laugh track droned on, absurdly cheerful against the sudden tension. Who's that? I whispered, my pulse racing so fast I could feel it in my fingertips. Mia stood, her movements slow and cautious. I don't know. My roommates are out, bar crawl downtown. No one's supposed to be here. She crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. Her shoulders stiffened, and she turned back to me, her face pale. It's a guy. Dark coat. Hat. He's just standing there. My stomach plummeted. Don't open it, I hissed, scrambling to my feet. Mia, don't. I'm not, she snapped, her voice low but firm. She grabbed her phone from the table, her thumb hovering over the screen. I'm calling the cops. Another knock, sharper this time, like a demand. I backed toward the couch, my eyes locked on the door. The knob jiggled slightly, and my breath caught. He was testing it. The lock held, but the sound sent a shiver down my spine, cold and electric. Mia's fingers flew across her phone, dialing 911, her voice trembling as she whispered into it. Yeah, hi, there's someone outside my house, keeps knocking, won't leave. 1432, Pine Street. Please hurry. The jiggling stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint crackle of the dispatcher's voice on Mia's phone. I edged toward the window, keeping low, and peeked through the gap in the curtains. The porch was empty. No man, no coat, just the flickering light and the wet steps gleaming under it. My chest tightened. He was gone, or he wanted us to think he was. Mia hung up, her breathing ragged. They're sending someone. 5 minutes, they said. 5 minutes is too long, I muttered, my voice barely audible. I clutched the note from my apartment, its edges digging into my palm. The rose stared up at me, mocking, its jagged lines a mirror to the fear clawing at my insides. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a hunt, and I was the prey. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as we waited. Every creak of the old house made me flinch, every shadow a threat. Mia stayed by the door, her phone still in hand, her eyes darting between me and the window. Lila, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Whatever this is, we're figuring it out. Together. Okay. I nodded, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me speak. Together. It was more than I'd had in years, more than I'd dared to hope for back when I was 13, alone in that cramped kitchen with Susan and James. The memory hit me hard, sharp and vivid, pulling me back despite the terror of the present. I'd been 13, my arms aching from scrubbing pots at the sink while the twins' 4th birthday party spilled into the living room. Balloons bobbed against the ceiling, their bright reds and blues clashing with the faded wallpaper. The air smelled of cake and spilled juice, and Avery and Mason's laughter rang out over the chatter of Susan's friends. I'd glanced at the calendar on the fridge, March 8th. My 11th birthday had been 2 weeks ago, unmarked, uncelebrated. No cake, no presents, just a curt, "We're busy, Lila," from Susan when I dared to ask. I'd kept my head down that day, washing dishes until my fingers pruned, resentment simmering under my skin. It wasn't fair. I'd managed the house, the twins, everything, while they got streamers and gifts. By the time the party ended, I was bone-tired, my stomach growling as I stared at the empty cake platter. Susan had swept in, her perfume sharp and cloying, and dumped a stack of plates in the sink. "Clean this up," she'd said, not even looking at me. "And don't eat anything. We're saving leftovers for the twins." Something snapped. I'd slammed a plate down. the clatter cutting through the room. Why? I'd shouted, my voice shaking with years of swallowed anger. Why do they get everything, and I get nothing? I'm not your maid. Susan's head whipped around, her eyes narrowing. Watch your tone, Lila. You live here, you help. That's how it works. No, it's how you work, I'd shot back, tears burning my eyes. I'm 13, and I'm doing more than you ever do. My birthday didn't even matter. James had lumbered in then, his face flushed from beer. Enough, he'd growled, pointing a finger at me. Go to your room. Now, no dinner. I'd stood there, chest heaving, defiance warring with despair. But I went, hungry, furious, and alone. That night, I'd promised myself I'd get out someday. And I had, until now. The wail of a siren snapped me back, faint but growing closer. Mia grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the window. They're here, she said, relief flooding her voice. Headlights flashed down the street, red and blue, slicing through the dark. I let out a shaky breath, but the tension didn't leave me. The cops could chase off whoever was out there tonight, but they couldn't erase the notes, the roses, the feeling of being watched. As the patrol car pulled up, I glanced at the crumpled note in my hand. The rose stared back, its jagged edges a promise of more to come. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The red and blue lights of the patrol car pulsed through Mia's living room curtains, painting jagged streaks across the walls. The siren's wail faded into a low hum as the officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the wet gravel outside. I stood by the window, my breath fogging the glass, the crumpled note still gripped in my hand. Mia hovered beside me, her arms crossed tight, her jaw set in that stubborn way she got when she was scared but refused to show it. The cops knocked, 2 sharp raps, steady and official, and she moved to let them in, leaving me alone with the weight of the night pressing down. The room felt too small, the air thick with the burnt popcorn smell and the faint buzz of the TV still chattering in the background. I sank onto the couch, my legs shaky, and smoothed the note out on my knee. That rose, jagged, uneven, stared up at me like a taunt. My mind churned, grasping at threads. The man in the coat, the guy at Taste of the Rose, Susan and James. None of it fit yet, but the pieces were there, lurking just out of reach. The truth was clawing its way up, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. The door creaked open, and 2 officers stepped inside, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Their radios crackled faintly, voices overlapping in static. Mia gestured toward me, her voice low as she explained the knocks, the notes, the man who'd vanished into the dark. I stood, brushing my damp hair back, and handed the taller officer the note from my apartment. His gloved fingers took it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. This was outside your place, he asked, his voice gruff but calm. His name tag read Sergeant Carter. Yeah, I said, my throat dry. And the other one, same handwriting, same rose, was in her mailbox this afternoon. I nodded toward Mia, who held out the second note like it might bite her. The shorter officer, Officer Reyes *, took it, her dark eyes scanning the paper. No address, no postage, she murmured, more to herself than us. Someone dropped these off personally. You see anyone suspicious tonight besides the guy at the door? I hesitated, the image of the man in the coat flashing through my mind, his stillness under the streetlight, the way he'd melted into the shadows. Maybe. Outside my building earlier. Dark coat, hat. Could have been the same guy who was here. Carter nodded, jotting something in a small notebook. We'll check the area, see if anyone saw him. You got any idea who might be behind this? Ex? Stalker? Someone with a grudge? My stomach twisted. I don't know. I don't have enemies. Not that I can think of. But the words felt hollow. Susan's sharp voice echoed in my head. Asterisk, you're ungrateful, Lila asterisk, and James's cold silence when I'd left. Could they really hate me this much? Enough to hunt me down after all this time? Reyes glanced up from the note. This rose, it mean anything to you? It's like the logo at my job, I said, my voice steadier now. Taste of the Rose, downtown. I'm a cook there. But this sketch, it's rough, not the same. Personal. The officers exchanged a look, quick and unreadable. Carter tucked the note into an evidence bag. We'll take these, run them for prints. Might be nothing, might be something. You staying here tonight? Yeah. Mia cut in before I could answer. She's not going back alone. Good. Reyes handed me a card with her name and a number scrawled on it. Call if anything else happens. We'll patrol the block for a bit, keep an eye out. They left as quickly as they'd come. The door thudding shut behind them. Mia locked it, then turned to me, her eyes fierce. You're sleeping here. No arguments. I managed a weak smile. Wasn't going to fight you on that. She grabbed a blanket from the pile on the couch and tossed it at me. Good. Now spill. What's rattling around in that head of yours? I know you're not telling me everything. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders, the coarse fabric scratching against my neck. She was right. I hadn't said it all, hadn't let myself unravel the knot of memory tightening in my chest. I took a deep breath, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I keep thinking about when I was 16. That's when it really fell apart with Susan and James. When they stopped pretending I was anything but a paycheck. Mia sat beside me, her knee brushing mine. What happened? I stared at the flickering TV, the laugh track jarring against the weight of the memory. I'd just turned 16. The twins were 9, old enough to handle themselves, but I was still doing everything. Cooking, cleaning, making sure they got to school. Susan came home one day from some lunch with her friends, all smug and perfumed, and announced I was getting a job. Brew and Bites Cafe. This rundown, little place a few blocks from the house. Said we needed the money, and I was old enough to contribute. Mia's brow creased. You were still in school. Yeah, didn't matter. They made me work after classes, weekends too. I'd stumble home smelling like grease and burnt coffee, hands raw from scrubbing counters. And every Friday, Susan would be waiting, hand out, taking my paychecks. For the family, she'd say, like I wasn't part of it. The room blurred as the memory sharpened. I was 16 again, standing in that cramped kitchen, the linoleum sticky under my sneakers. The air smelled of stale coffee and the twins' leftover macaroni, congealing in a pot on the stove. Susan sat at the table, her nails clicking against a glass of wine, while James leaned against the counter, flipping through a newspaper. I'd just gotten home from a double shift, my apron still tied around my waist, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. I got news, I'd said, my voice cutting through the quiet. I'd been nervous, but excited, clutching the edge of the counter for support. Nick, he owns Taste of the Rose, he offered to pay for cooking classes. Says I've got talent. It's a real shot at something. Susan's head tilted, her lips thinning into a line. Cooking classes? What? You think you're too good for Brew and Bites now? No, I'd faltered, the excitement curdling in my chest. It's a chance to learn, to get better, maybe make a career out of it. James snorted, not looking up from his paper. A career. You're 16, Lila. You don't need dreams. You need to help us out. Help you out. The words had burst out, sharp and jagged. I've been helping since I was 7. I cook, I clean, I work. And you take every dime I make. When do I get something for me? Susan's glass hit the table with a crack. Watch your mouth. We're a family, we all pitch in. You think those twins don't cost money? Clothes, school supplies. Then get a job yourself. I'd shouted, my voice trembling with years of pent-up rage. Why is it always me? Avery and Mason get new shoes, birthday parties. I got nothing for mine. I'm not your damn servant. The silence after was deafening. Susan's eyes narrowed, cold and hard, and James finally looked up, his face flushed. "You're grounded," he'd said, his voice low and final. "No job, no classes. You'll stay home and pull your weight." I'd laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Pull my weight? I've been carrying this family for years. I'd ripped off the apron, throwing it on the floor, and stormed out, the slam of my bedroom door echoing behind me. Back on Mia's couch, I blinked, the memory fading into the dim light. My hands are clenched, nails digging into my palms. "That's when I knew I had to get out," I said, my voice hoarse. They didn't care about me. They just wanted what I could give them. I stuck it out 2 more years, saved every tip I could hide, and left the day after graduation. Mia's hand found mine, squeezing tight. "They're assholes, Lila. But this, notes, threats, it's not their style. They're lazy, not vengeful." "Maybe," I murmured, but doubt gnawed at me. Or maybe I underestimated how much they resented me leaving. A soft thud came from the back of the house, faint, like something brushing the wall. Mia tensed, her grip tightening. What was that? My heart kicked up again, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. "Back door." She nodded, standing slowly. "It's locked. I checked earlier." But her voice wavered, and I followed her as she crept toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under us. The kitchen was dark, the only light a faint glow from the street, filtering through the window above the sink. The air smelled of dish soap and damp wood, and the back door stood closed, its glass panel black and unyielding. Mia flipped the light switch, the harsh fluorescent buzz filling the silence. Nothing, just the chipped counter, the dripping faucet, the shadows stretching long and thin. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement outside the glass. My breath caught, and I grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her back. "There's someone out there." She squinted, stepping closer despite my grip. "I don't see." A face pressed against the glass, sudden, pale, eyes wide and staring. I yelped, stumbling back, my hips slamming into the counter. Mia cursed, her phone slipping from her hand to clatter on the floor. The face vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the dark, but the image burned into my mind. Sharp cheekbones, a shadowed jaw, a hat pulled low. "Call the cops again." I rasped, my voice shaking. Mia scrambled for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed. I backed toward the living room, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker as Mia stammered out the update. My pulse thundered, drowning out her words. That face, it wasn't Susan or James. It wasn't anyone I knew. But those eyes, wild and unblinking, knew me. And the rose, the notes, they weren't just threats. They were a promise. The truth was peeling back, layer by layer, and it wasn't my family behind it. It was something, someone else. Someone who'd been watching longer than I'd realized, waiting for the moment I thought I was free. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, casting a stark glare across the chipped linoleum as Mia's voice trembled into her phone, relaying the face at the window to the dispatcher. My back pressed against the counter, the edge biting into my spine, but I barely felt it. My eyes stayed glued to the back door, the black glass reflecting nothing but the harsh fluorescence inside. That face, those wild, unblinking eyes, had burned into me, a snapshot of terror I couldn't shake. It wasn't Susan. It wasn't James. It was someone else, someone who'd been shadowing my every move, and now they were here, inches away, separated only by a flimsy lock and a pane of glass. "Lila!" Mia hissed, her phone still pressed to her ear. "Get away from the counter. Come here." Her free hand waved me toward her, her face pale, but her jaw tight with that fierce resolve I'd always envied. I nodded, my legs shaky as I edged toward her, keeping the door in my peripheral vision. The air smelled of dish soap and fear, thick and cloying, and my sneakers squeaked faintly against the floor. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. "Stay calm. Officers are en route." But calm was a distant memory. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat a countdown to whatever came next. I reached Mia's side, her warmth a small anchor in the chaos, and we stood there, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the door like it might spring to life. A sharp thud rattled the frame, sudden and brutal, and I flinched, a yelp escaping before I could stop it. The glass shivered, but held, the lock rattling faintly. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging in as she whispered, "They're coming. Just hold on." But her voice wavered, and I could feel her trembling too. Another thud, harder this time, deliberate, and a crack splintered across the glass, thin and jagged like a lightning bolt. My stomach lurched. He wasn't knocking anymore. He was breaking in. I scanned the kitchen, my mind racing for something, anything, a weapon, a shield. The knife block sat on the counter, but it was too far, and my hands were shaking too badly to trust myself with it. A broom leaned against the wall, its handle worn and splintered. Not much, but better than nothing. I lunged for it, the wood rough against my palms as I gripped it tight. "Lila, what are you?" Mia started, but I cut her off, my voice low and fierce. "If he gets in, I'm not just standing here." Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She snatched a frying pan from the stove, its weight clanging softly as she hefted it. We stood there, makeshift weapons in hand, the absurdity of it almost laughable if it weren't so terrifying. The dispatcher's voice droned on, promising help, but the seconds stretched into eternity, each one punctuated by the drip of the faucet and the pounding of my pulse. A shadow shifted outside the glass, dark and fluid, and then a fist slammed against it once, twice. The crack widened, spider-webbing across the pane, and I braced myself, the broom raised like a spear. My breath came in ragged gasps, fear clawing up my throat, but beneath it, something else flickered, anger, sharp and hot. I'd spent years running from threats, bending under the weight of Susan and James, shrinking to fit their demands. Not this time. Whoever this was, whatever they wanted, I wasn't going down without a fight. The glass shattered inward with a deafening crash, shards exploding across the floor like jagged rain. I stumbled back, my sneakers crunching on the debris, as a gloved hand reached through, groping for the lock. Mia swung the pan, a wild arc that smashed against the wrist with a sickening thud. A muffled curse came from outside, low and furious, and the hand yanked back, disappearing into the dark. "Go," I shouted, shoving Mia toward the living room. She stumbled but caught herself, and we bolted, the broom still clutched in my hands. My heart pounded as we skidded into the dim light of the TV, the laugh track jarring against the chaos. The front door loomed ahead, our escape, but a creak from the kitchen stopped me cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching over the broken glass. He was inside. Mia fumbled with the front door's lock, her fingers slipping on the chain. Come on," she muttered, panic edging her voice. I spun around, the broom raised, my eyes darting to the kitchen archway. The shadow shifted, and then he was there, a silhouette in the doorway, tall and broad, the dark coat hanging off him like a shroud. The hat obscured his face, but those eyes glinted beneath the brim, locked on me, unblinking and wild. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice cracking but steady enough. "Get out, or I didn't finish." What could I say? I'd hit him with a broom? But I tightened my grip, stepping in front of Mia as she wrestled with the chain. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his presence a weight that pressed the air from my lungs. The chain clinked free, and Mia yanked the door open, the cold night air rushing in. "Lila, now!" she screamed, grabbing my arm. I hesitated, my eyes still on him, searching for something, recognition, intent, but there was nothing but that stare, cold and bottomless. Then he took a step forward, slow and deliberate, and my nerve broke. I turned and ran, Mia pulling me onto the porch as sirens wailed closer, their red and blue lights flashing down the street. We stumbled down the steps, my breath hitching as I glanced back. He was gone, melted back into the house, or out the way he'd come, I couldn't tell. The The patrol car screeched to a stop, officers spilling out, shouting commands I'd barely heard over the roar in my ears. Mia clung to me, her frying pan still in hand, as Carter and Reyes approached, their faces grim. "He's inside," I rasped, pointing at the duplex. "Broke the back door." My voice faltered, the words dissolving into a sob I couldn't hold back. Carter nodded, barking orders into his radio as Reyes guided us toward the car. "Stay here," she said, her tone firm but gentle. "We'll handle it." I sank against the hood, the metal cold through my coat, and buried my face in my hands. The tears came hot and fast, fear and fury tangling into a knot I couldn't unravel. Mia's arm wrapped around me, her breathing ragged but steady, and I clung to her like a lifeline. The officers moved toward the house, flashlights slicing through the dark, but I couldn't watch. I couldn't move. All I could see was that face, those eyes, and the rows sketched in my mind, jagged, personal, a mark I couldn't escape. "He knew me," I whispered, more to myself than Mia. "He's been watching me." She squeezed my shoulder, her voice tight. "We'll figure it out. He's not getting away with this." But as the officers disappeared into the duplex, the night swallowing them whole, doubt gnawed at me. He'd gotten this far, past locks, past shadows, past every wall I'd built. And I still didn't know who he was. The memory of my 16th year surged back, unbidden, sharp as the glass on Mia's floor. It wasn't the same, but it felt the same, cornered, trapped, fighting for a scrap of myself. I'd been 16, stumbling home from brew and bites after a grueling Saturday shift. The air had smelled of fryer grease and rain, my apron damp against my thighs as I pushed through the front door. The house was a mess, pizza boxes strewn across the coffee table, soda cans toppling onto the carpet. The twins' 9th birthday party had just ended, their friends gone, leaving Avery and Mason sprawled on the couch with new video games blinking on the TV. Susan lounged in the recliner, a glass of wine in hand, while James dozed in the kitchen, a beer bottle tipped over beside him. I dropped my bag by the door, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, and headed for the kitchen. A half-eaten pizza sat on the counter, grease congealing on the pepperoni. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since noon, too busy pouring coffee and dodging the manager's snide remarks. I reached for a slice, the crust still warm, when Susan's voice cut through the haze. "Lila, what are you doing?" I froze, my hand hovering. "I'm hungry. It's just leftovers." "Those are for the twins," she snapped, sitting up straighter. "You know the rules. Clean this up first. Then you can eat whatever's left." "Clean it up." I turned, the slice still in my hand, anger flaring hot and sudden. "I just worked 10 hours. I've been on my feet all day, and you want me to play maid while they sit there? I'm starving, Susan." Her eyes narrowed, the wineglass clinking as she set it down. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. You live here, you contribute. That's how it works." "No, that's how you work." I shouted, slamming the pizza back onto the box. "I contribute every damn day. I work, I cook, I clean, and you take it all. When do I get a break? When do I get to be a kid?" James stirred, his voice groggy but sharp. "Enough, Lila. You're grounded. No more attitude." "Grounded." I laughed bitter and loud, tears stinging my eyes. "For wanting to eat? For wanting something for myself? You're unbelievable." Susan stood, her face flushed. "Go to your room. Now. And don't touch that food." I stared at them, chest heaving, defiance roaring through me. "Fine," I'd hissed, grabbing the slice anyway. "But I'm not your servant anymore." I'd taken a bite, the cheese burning my tongue, and stormed upstairs, their shouts echoing behind me. That night, I'd eaten alone, the taste of rebellion sweeter than the pizza itself. Now, leaning against the patrol car, that memory felt like a mirror to this moment, cornered again, but not by family this time. By something darker, something I couldn't name. The officers emerged from the duplex, their faces tight, and Carter approached, his flashlight dangling at his side. "He's gone," he said, his voice clipped. "Back door's a mess, but no sign of him. Footprints in the yard, though, headed toward the alley. We'll canvass the area. Gone." The word sank into me, heavy and hollow. He'd slipped away again, a shadow I couldn't catch. But he'd been here, close enough to touch, close enough to kill, and that truth tightened around me like a noose. I wasn't just hiding anymore. I was hunted, and as the night pressed in, cold and endless, I knew the next move wasn't his alone. It was mine. The cold metal of the patrol cars had seeped through my coat, grounding me as the officers' voices faded into a low murmur. Their flashlights bobbed in the dark, slicing through the alley behind Mia's duplex. But I knew they wouldn't find him. He was a shadow, a ghost, slipping through cracks I couldn't see, leaving only jagged roses and broken glass in his wake. My breath fogged in the March night, each exhale a shaky testament to the fear still clawing at my chest. Mia stood beside me, her frying pan dangling from her hand, her eyes darting between me and the house. The red and blue lights pulsed against her pale face, making her look younger, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "He's gone," I whispered, the words tasting bitter. Again. "Not for long," Mia said, her voice tight with defiance. "Cops'll get him. Or we will." She squeezed my arm, but her grip trembled, betraying the bravado. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to cling to that thin thread of hope, but the weight of the night, the notes, the face at the window, the gloved hand smashing through, pressed down until I could barely breathe. He wasn't just watching anymore. He'd crossed the line, stepped into my world, and I had no idea why. My fingers curled around Officer Reyes's card in my pocket, the edges digging into my skin. "Call if anything happens," she'd said. But what if it already had? What if this was the moment I couldn't outrun? The officers returned, their boots crunching on the gravel. Carter's face was etched with frustration, his jaw tight. "No sign of him," he said, holstering his flashlight. "Footprints lead to the alley, then nothing. Must have had a car waiting. We'll keep a unit nearby tonight, but you should stay somewhere safe." Safe, I echoed, the word hollow. Where was that? My studio, with its flimsy lock and shadowed hallway? Here, with a shattered back door and a threat still lingering in the air? I glanced at Mia, her fierce eyes meeting mine, and knew I couldn't drag her deeper into this. Not when he'd already found her too. "I'll figure something out," I said, forcing my voice steady. "Thanks." Carter nodded, but his eyes lingered, like he could see the cracks I was trying to hide. He and Reyes climbed back into the patrol car, the engine rumbling to life as they pulled away, leaving us in the flickering glow of the porch light. The night stretched around us, cold and endless, the damp air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or the faint tang of danger that wouldn't let go. Mia turned to me, her frying pan clattering as she set it on the porch railing. "You're not going back to your place alone. No way." "I know," I said, rubbing my arms against the chill. "But I can't stay here either. He knows this spot now. He'll come back." Her brow furrowed, and she opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. "Mia, you've done enough. More than enough. I'll call Nick. He's got that spare room above the restaurant. It's not much, but it's got a deadbolt and a fire escape. I'll be okay there. Nick." She frowned, crossing her arms. "Your boss? You sure he's not part of this?" The question stung, but I shook my head. "No, he's the one person who's given me a shot when no one else would." "He's not." I stopped, the doubt creeping in despite myself. The rose. Taste of the rose. Could it be tied to him? But Nick's gruff kindness, his offer to fund cooking classes, it didn't fit. "It's not him," I said, firmer this time. "I trust him." Mia studied me, then sighed. "Fine, but I'm coming with you to get your stuff. You're not walking back alone." I didn't fight her on that. The thought of facing my studio, The empty hallway, the shadows lurking outside, made my stomach twist. Okay, let's go. We grabbed what we could from her place, a backpack with her phone charger and a change of clothes, my coat still damp from the run over, and headed out. The street was quiet, the laundromat's neon sign buzzing faintly across the road, but every rustle of leaves, every flicker of light, set my nerves on edge. Mia walked close, her shoulder brushing mine, a silent promise she wouldn't let me face this alone. My sneakers slapped against the wet pavement, the sound too loud in the stillness, and I kept my eyes scanning, searching for that dark coat, those wild eyes. By the time we reached my building, the drizzle had started again, a fine mist that clung to my hair and blurred the streetlights. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar smell of mildew and old paint hitting me like a punch. The hallway stretched dark and silent, the single bulb flickering weakly overhead. My keys jangled in my hand, the noise echoing as we climbed the stairs, each step a test of my fraying courage. My apartment door loomed ahead, the brass knob dull in the dim light. I hesitated, my hand hovering, the memory of that thud, the note slipping under, flooding back. Mia nudged me gently. "I've got your back," she said, her voice low but steady. I nodded, swallowing hard, and turned the key. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The studio lay still, the faint hum of the fridge the only sound. The lavender scent from the armchair lingered, but it felt wrong now, tainted by the night's terror. My quilt lay crumpled on the bed, the bookshelf sagging under its load, but my eyes locked on the counter. The butcher knife still sat there, its blade glinting faintly, a reminder of how close I'd come to needing it. "Pack fast," Mia said, stepping inside and closing the door behind us. She flipped the deadbolt, the sound sharp and final. "I don't like this." "Me neither." I crossed to the bed, grabbing a duffel from under the frame. My hands moved on autopilot, stuffing in jeans, a sweater, my favorite cookbook with its cracked spine. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch, every shadow a threat. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see that face pressed against it, but the glass reflected only the room, dark and distorted. A soft scrape came from the hallway, barely audible, but it stopped me cold. My breath caught, the duffel slipping from my hands to thud on the floor. Mia froze too, her eyes wide as she turned toward the door. "You hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah." My voice was a rasp, barely there. I edged toward the door, my pulse hammering, and pressed my ear to the wood. The radiator hissed faintly down the hall, the drip of the pipe a steady rhythm. But beneath it, something else. A shuffle, a breath. My stomach dropped. "He's out there." Mia grabbed the knife from the counter, her knuckles white around the handle. "We need to go. Now." I nodded, my mind racing. The fire escape, out the window down to the alley. It was our only shot. I darted to the sill, fumbling with the latch, the cold metal biting my fingers. The window stuck, years of paint sealing it shut, and panic clawed at me. "Come on," I muttered, shoving harder. It gave with a groan, the damp air rushing in as I pushed it wide. The scrape came again, louder, closer, and then a thud against the door, sharp and deliberate. Mia yelped, backing toward me, the knife raised. "Lila, hurry!" I swung a leg over the sill, the fire escape's rusted metal creaking under my weight. The alley below stretched dark and narrow, puddles gleaming under the drizzle, but it was freedom, or close enough. "Mia, come on!" I hissed, reaching for her. She hesitated, her eyes locked on the door as it rattled again, harder this time. The wood groaned, the lock straining, and I saw the fear flash across her face, raw, unguarded. "Go," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll hold him off. Get to Nick." "No way." I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the window. "We're both getting out. Move." The door buckled with a crack, the frame splintering, and Mia stumbled toward me, the knife clattering to the floor. I yanked her through the window, just as the door gave way, slamming open with a deafening bang. I didn't look back, couldn't, but I felt him, his presence flooding the room like a storm. Heavy footsteps thudded behind us as we scrambled onto the fire escape, the metal shaking under our weight. Go, go, go! I shouted, shoving Mia ahead. The stairs rattled as we descended, my hands slipping on the wet railing, my breath hitching with every step. The alley loomed closer, the ground slick and shadowed, but safe if we could just reach it. A clang echoed above us. He was on the escape, his boots pounding the metal, gaining fast. My foot slipped on the last rung, and I hit the pavement hard, pain shooting through my ankle. Mia grabbed my arm, hauling me up, her face streaked with rain and terror. "Run!" she gasped, and we bolted, the alley stretching endless before us. His steps thundered behind, closer now, a shadow at the edge of my vision. Dark coat, hat low, those wild eyes burning through the night. The street ahead glowed, faintly, headlights flickering through the drizzle. Taste of the Rose was 6 blocks, too far, but Nick's spare room, his promise of safety, was all I had. My lungs burned, my ankle throbbing, but I pushed harder, Mia's hand tight in mine. A car horn blared as we burst onto the road, tires screeching, and I risked a glance back. He was there, at the alley's mouth, motionless, watching. Then he turned, melting into the dark, and my knees nearly buckled. We didn't stop. Not until the restaurant sign loomed ahead, the rose etched in neon flickering against the brick. I pounded on the back door, my fists raw, my voice breaking as I shouted Nick's name. The lock clicked, and his broad frame filled the doorway, his gray eyes narrowing as he took us in. Soaked, shaking, alive. "Get inside," he said, stepping aside. "Now." We stumbled into the warmth, the smell of garlic and thyme wrapping around us, and the door slammed shut, the deadbolt sliding home. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving, tears mixing with the rain on my face. Mia sank beside me, her breaths ragged, and Nick loomed over us, his voice low and urgent. What the hell happened? I met his gaze, the terror still pulsing through me, but beneath it, a spark flared, fierce, defiant. "Someone's trying to kill me," I said, the words raw and real, "and I'm not letting them win." The kitchen at Taste of the Rose was a sanctuary of heat and noise, the clatter of pots and the hiss of sizzling oil wrapping around me like a shield. I leaned against the wall, my soaked coat dripping onto the tiled floor, the sharp tang of garlic and thyme cutting through the fog of fear, still clouding my mind. Mia slumped beside me, her breath shallow and uneven, her dark curls plastered to her face. Nick stood over us, his broad frame filling the doorway, his gray eyes sharp with concern. The deadbolt on the back door clicked shut behind him, a heavy, final sound that sealed us in, and whatever was out there out. What the hell happened? Nick's voice was low, rough with urgency, his hands planted on his hips as he took in our bedraggled state. I met his gaze, my chest still heaving, the words clawing their way out. "Someone's trying to kill me," I said, raw and unfiltered, "and I'm not letting them win." The defiance in my voice surprised me, a spark flaring through the exhaustion and terror, lighting something fierce I hadn't felt in years. Nick's brow furrowed, but he didn't question it. He stepped closer, his work boots scuffing the floor, and crouched to my level. "Start from the beginning, Lila. Who's after you?" I swallowed, the taste of rain and panic bitter on my tongue, and pulled the crumpled note from my pocket. The jagged rose stared up at me, its edges smudged but no less menacing. I handed it to him, my fingers trembling. "It started with this, left outside my apartment tonight, then another at Mia's place, and then he broke into her house, chased us here." Mia nodded, her voice shaky but firm, smashed the back door, came after us with no warning. We barely got out. Nick unfolded the note, his jaw tightening as he read the scrawled threat. You can't hide forever. I know where you are. His eyes flicked to the rose, then back to me, a shadow crossing his face. This rose, it's like ours, but not. You think it's tied to the restaurant. I don't know, I admitted, rubbing my arms against the chill seeping through my wet clothes. Maybe. There was a guy here tonight, dark coat, hat, sat at the counter too long. Jess said he left when I did. Could have followed me home. And then my voice faltered, the memory of those wild eyes at Mia's window flashing through me. He's been watching me. For weeks, maybe longer. Nick stood abruptly, crossing to the prep counter where a cordless phone sat amid stacks of order slips. I'm calling the cops again. They need to know he's still out there. His fingers punched the numbers with a force that echoed his frustration, the line ringing as he muttered under his breath. I sank onto a stool, the cold metal biting through my jeans, and buried my face in my hands. The kitchen's warmth should have comforted me, the hum of the exhaust fan, the faint bubble of a pot left simmering on the stove, but it didn't. My ankle throbbed from the fall off the fire escape, a dull ache that matched the pounding in my skull. Mia slid onto the stool beside me, her hand finding mine, her grip tight and steady. We're safe here, she whispered, more to herself than me. He can't get in. I wanted to believe her, but the memory of that gloved hand smashing through glass, those heavy footsteps on the fire escape, lingered like a stain. Safe was a lie I couldn't afford anymore. I lifted my head, meeting her gaze, and saw my own fear reflected back, mingled with a stubborn resolve that kept us both upright. Nick hung up, his expression grim. Cops are on their way. Said they've got units patrolling your block and Mia's. They'll check the alley too. But you're staying here tonight, both of you. I've got the room upstairs. It's not fancy, but it's got a lock and a view of the street. Thanks, I murmured, gratitude swelling in my chest. Nick had been my lifeline before, offering me this job, the cooking classes, and now here he was again, a steady anchor in a storm I couldn't navigate alone. He waved it off, grabbing a towel from a stack by the sink and tossing it to me. Dry off. I'll get some coffee going. You look like you need it. As he busied himself at the coffee maker, the rich, bitter scent filling the air, I wiped the rain from my face and let the towel fall to my lap. My mind churned, grasping at the edges of a truth I could feel, but couldn't see. The rose, the notes, the man, they weren't random. They were personal, a thread tied to something I'd buried deep. Not Susan or James. They didn't have the patience for this kind of vendetta. But who? A sharp rap at the back door jolted me upright, my heart lurching into my throat. Nick spun around, his hand on a butcher knife before I could blink, and Mia gripped my arm, her nails digging in. Who's there? He barked, his voice a low growl. Police, came the muffled reply, steady and official. Sergeant Carter. Open up. Nick lowered the knife, exhaling hard, and crossed to the door. The deadbolt slid back, and Carter stepped in, rain dripping from his cap, followed by Reyes, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Their radios crackled faintly, a lifeline to the outside world I wasn't sure I trusted anymore. You two again, Carter said, his eyes landing on me and Mia. Heard you had another run-in. You okay? Barely, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He broke into my place this time, chased us down the fire escape. We lost him in the alley. Reyes frowned, jotting notes. Description. Same as before, Mia cut in. Dark coat, hat pulled low. Couldn't see his face clear, but he's tall, broad. Fast. Carter nodded, his gaze shifting to Nick. You see anything around here? Suspicious types hanging out. Nick shook his head. Not tonight. Place was dead after closing, pun intended. But I'll pull the security footage from the dining room. Might have caught that guy at the counter. My pulse quickened. You've got cameras? Installed them last year after some break-ins, Nick said, already moving toward a small office tucked behind the kitchen. Grainy as hell, but better than nothing. The officers followed him, leaving me and Mia in the kitchen, the coffee maker gurgling as it finished its brew. I stood, pacing to the stove, the heat from the simmering pot brushing my skin. The normalcy of it, the clink of mugs as Nick had set them out, the faint hum of the fridge, felt surreal against the chaos of the night. I gripped the counter, my knuckles whitening, and closed my eyes, willing the pieces to fall into place. Footsteps returned, heavier now, and I turned as Nick emerged, a laptop under his arm. Carter and Reyes trailed him, their faces tight with focus. He set the computer on the prep table, flipping it open, and tapped the keys until a grainy black and white feed flickered to life. "This is from tonight," he said, fast-forwarding through hours of empty tables and dim lights. "Here, around 10. The screen showed the counter, Jess wiping it down as the last customers trickled out. Then him, the man in the dark coat, hat low, hunched over a mug. My breath caught. He sat still, too still, his head angled slightly toward the kitchen pass-through where I'd been working, watching me. "There," I said, pointing, my voice tight. "That's him." Carter leaned in, squinting. Can't make out his face. Hat's in the way. But the timing fits. Left right after you, like your friend said. Nick scrubbed a hand over his jaw. "I've seen him before. Not regular, but maybe a month ago. Sat in the same spot, same vibe. Didn't think much of it. A month ago." The words hit me like a punch, dragging a memory from the haze. I'd been here late, experimenting with a new sauce after closing, the kitchen quiet except for the soft jazz Nick played on the radio. I'd glanced out the pass-through, catching a shadow at the counter. A man, coat dark, hat low. He'd been gone when I looked again, and I'd chalked it up to exhaustion. But now, "He's been stalking me," I whispered, the realization sinking in cold and heavy. Before the notes. Before tonight. Reyes looked up from her clipboard. "You know anyone who'd fixate like this? Old job? Family trouble?" I shook my head, then stopped, the weight of my past pressing down. "My parents, Susan and James, they resented me leaving, but this isn't them. They're not obsessive. I've kept my life small since then. Just Mia, this job. No one else." Carter's radio crackled, a voice cutting through. "Sarge, we've got something. Alley off Pine. Witness saw a guy matching the description peel out in a gray sedan. No plates, but we're running it." "Keep us posted," Carter replied, then turned to me. "We'll track him. For now, you stay put. We'll post a unit outside." They left with promises of updates. The door thudding shut behind them. Nick poured coffee into mugs, sliding one to me, the steam curling up in the dim light. "Drink," he said, his tone gruff but kind. "Then get upstairs. You need rest." I took the mug, the warmth seeping into my hands, but rest felt impossible. Mia sipped hers, her eyes on me, and I knew she saw it, the shift in me, the moment fear hardened into something else. Resolve. Weeks later, the air smelled of spring, rain and blooming roses, the kind that didn't scare me anymore. I stood in my studio, the same mismatched furniture bathed in morning light, the quilt smoothed over my bed. The deadbolt was new, gleaming brass, and the window locked tight. I'd kept the place, refused to let him take it from me, and now it felt mine again, reclaimed. The phone buzzed on the counter, Mia's name lighting up the screen. "You ready?" her text read. "Big day." I smiled, grabbing my apron, clean pressed, the taste of the rose logo stitched in red. Today was my first shift as assistant chef. Nick's faith in me made real. I typed back, "Hell yes," and headed out, the door clicking shut behind me. The street hummed with life, cars splashing through puddles, a barista calling orders across the road. I walked to the restaurant, my steps light, the weight of the past lifting with every breath. The twins' 16th birthday had been the trigger, the night Susan denied me food, demanded I clean while they celebrated, the moment I'd chosen myself. I'd moved in with Mia, cut ties, thrived. And now here I was free, Hold the shadow gone. At taste of the rose, Nick greeted me with a nod, a rare grin tugging at his lips. Ready to run the kitchen, chef? Born ready, I said, tying my apron, the familiar chaos of the stove calling me home. Later, on Mia's balcony, we toasted with cheap wine, the city sprawling below. To freedom, she said, clinking her glass against mine. To fighting for it, I added, the taste sharp and sweet on my tongue. The rose neon glowed in the distance, a symbol not of fear, but of resilience, a life I'd built, brick by brick, from the ashes of what came before.